Good morning, psychology. So today we move into single subject research, single subject designs. So wasting no time, let's get into that. So let me share my screen with you guys. And let's begin. Okay, Chapter 10, single subject research. As usual, there are always learning objectives that you can find at the beginning of our lectures. And these are to help you with the quizzes. These are to make sure that you take away every single week with you the main points, okay? So can you explain what single subject research is this week? Can you explain what a case study is, and can you decipher between the two? They are not interchangeable, okay? And can you describe the basic elements of single subject research designs? Can you explain how single subject research designs address the issue of internal validity? Lastly, can you explain some of the points of disagreement between advocates of single subject and group research? Okay, so you can also find some of the learning objectives in our Blackboard course right at the beginning of the corresponding week. So simply click on week 10. Right at the beginning, you will notice some learning objectives. Again, those are the broad overarching learning objectives that specifically the school wants you to take away. Sound good? Okay. So before we get into what single subject research is, I do want to go over briefly what the entire chapter is going to go over, okay? Most of Paul Price's book is about group research. So we went over non-experimental research, experimental research, complex research designs, and we went over multiple types of each one. Okay, so again, most of the book is about group research, which typically involves studying a large number of participants and combining their data to draw general conclusions about human behavior. This specific chapter, chapter 10 on single subject research, typically involves studying a small number of participants and focusing closely on each individual. Okay, so that's what we're going to get out of this chapter this week. The first part, or the first section of chapter 10, goes over what single subject research is. Specifically in this first section, Paul Price is going to explain what single subject research is, including how it differs from other types of psychological research. He's going to explain what case studies are, and include the strengths of case studies and the weaknesses of case studies. And lastly, in this first section, he's going to explain who uses single subject research and why they specifically use single subject research. And so let's begin. What is single subject research? Single subject research is a type of quantitative research that involves examining the behavior the behavior of each of a small number of participants in detail. The term specifically single subject does not mean that only one participant is studied, but the name single subject actually refers to the intensive focus on the behavior of each individual participant. Okay? So how does that differ from group research? Okay, group research involves studying a large number of participants and examining their behavior in terms of group means and standard deviations. Single subject research is very different from a case study. Okay, a case study is a detailed description of an individual, which can include both qualitative and quantitative analysis. There are some advantages to a case study. I don't have this in its own slide, which I should have put in its own slide, but I didn't. But let me list out some of the advantages of a case study for you. Okay, case studies can be useful for suggesting new research questions and for illustrating general principles. Okay. Case studies are also useful for understanding rare phenomenon as the effects of damage to a specific part of the brain. Okay, those are two advantages of a case study. Some of the disadvantages of a case study, I'll list them out for you as well. And again, you find them in the chapter. Okay. Case studies are poor substitutes for carefully designing group or single research studies. Okay. One reason specifically is that case studies usually do not allow researchers to determine whether events are specific or casually related. Okay. A second reason why case studies aren't necessarily the best is that an individual case can always be unusual in some way and therefore be unrepresentative of people more generally. Thus, case studies have serious problems with both internal and external validity. Now, some of the assumptions of single subject research, okay, and they're listed out in the textbook, okay. The first assumption is that it's important to focus intensively on the behavior of individual participants. It's important to discover causal relationships through the manipulation of an independent variable, the careful measurement of dependent variable, and the control of extraneous variables. It's important to study strong and consistent effects that have biological or social importance. Okay. Before we get into who uses single subject research, social validity is a term that arises in the textbook, and it's fairly new because we know internal and external, right? But social validity is when applied researchers in particular are interested in treatments that have substantial effects on important behaviors and which can be implemented reliably in the real world context in which they occur. B.F. Skinner and others have used single subject research to discover many basic principles of operant conditioning. This approach, which typically uses non-human subjects such as rats and pigeons, is called experimental analysis of behavior. Okay? When this approach is used to address applied research questions with human subjects, it's called applied behavior analysis. And who uses single subject research today? Obviously, after reviewing B.F. Skinner in the textbook, okay? Single subject research has been around since the beginning of the field of psychology. Today, it's most strongly associated with the behavioral theoretical perspective, but it can also be used to study behavior from any perspective, okay? So theoretical perspectives, or people who are utilizing that type of lens when they are conducting their research, are more likely to use a single subject research design. But again, any type of psychologist can utilize this, okay? But again, it's for really looking at a small number of people and then specifically looking at the outcome and the effect on each individual participant. So quickly, some takeaways from the first section of our textbook, okay? Some of the takeaways here is that single subject research, which involves testing a small number of participants and focusing intensely on the behavior of each individual, is important, or is an important alternative to group research in psychology. Single subject studies must be distinguished from case studies in which an individual case is described in detail. Case studies can be useful for generating new research questions, for studying rare phenomenon, and for illustrating general principles. They are not useful, however, as evidence for new phenomena or theories because they are low in internal and external validity. Lastly, single subject research has been around since the beginning of the field of psychology. Today, it's most strongly associated with the behavioral theoretical perspective, but it can be used to study behavior from any perspective, from any lens. Okay. Our next section goes over single subject research design specifically, okay? In this next section, which we're going to start off with figure 10.3 in this discussion of the second section, Paul Price is going to describe the basic elements of single subject research designs. He's going to show us how to design simple single subject studies using reversal and multiple baseline designs. He's going to explain how single subject research designs address the issue of internal validity. And then lastly, he's going to show us how to interpret the results of simple single subject studies based on the visual inspection of graphed data, okay? So some general features of single subject designs. This is figure 10.3. You can actually locate figure 10.3 on page 175 in your textbook. This is a figure of a generic single subject study, okay? So pause the video here and please definitely read on this graph, but I'm gonna go through it as well, of course, okay? So figure 10.3, the results of a generic single subject study illustrating several principles of single subject research design, okay? So here, Paul Price specifically tells us to consider some of the features that are common when it comes to single subject study designs, okay? The features are illustrated specifically in this figure, which shows, again, the result of a generic single subject study, okay? So what we have here, the dependent variable, which is represented by the y-axis of the graph, is measured repeatedly over time, represented by the x-axis of the graph at regular intervals. The study is divided into distinct phases during which the participant is tested under one condition per phase, okay? Another important aspect of single subject research is that the change from one condition to the next does not usually occur after a fixed amount of time or a number of observations. Rather, it depends on the participant's behavior. The researcher waits until the participant's behavior in one condition becomes fairly consistent from observation to observation before changing the condition. This is referred to as steady state strategy, okay? So pause again your, or the lecture here. You can find the description, and I briefly just went over it, but you can find the description of what you are viewing on page 174 in your textbook and the graph on page 175, okay? Paul Price then goes into reversal designs, okay? The most basic single subject research design is the reversal design, also called ABA design, okay? When it comes to ABA design, a baseline is established for the dependent variable. This is the level of responding before any treatment is introduced, and therefore the base phase is a kind of control condition, okay? In a multiple treatment reversal design, a baseline phase is followed by separate phases in which different treatments are introduced, okay? In an alternating treatment design, two or more treatments are alternated relatively quickly on a regular schedule. Two potential problems with the reversal design is that if a treatment is working, it may be unethical to then remove it. So for example, if a treatment seemed to reduce the incidence of self-injury in a developmentally disabled child, it would be unethical to remove that treatment to show that the incidence of self-injury then would increase, okay? Another potential problem is that the dependent variable may not return to baseline when the treatment is removed. So for example, when positive attention for studying is removed, a student might continue to study at an increased rate, okay? So again, two potential problems. If a treatment is working, it's unethical to remove it, and then the dependent variable may not return to baseline when the treatment is removed, okay? One solution to these problems is to use a multiple baseline design. For this specific example, please refer to figure 10.5, which is here, okay? So please pause and view this. So here in one version of the design, a baseline is established for each of the several participants, and the treatment is then introduced for each one. In essence, each participant is tested in an A-B design. The key to the design is that the treatment is introduced at different times for each participant. The idea is that if the dependent variable changes with the treatment, when the treatment is introduced for one participant, it might be a coincidence. But if the dependent variable changes when the treatment is introduced for multiple participants, especially when the treatment is introduced at different times for different participants, then it's extremely unlikely to be a coincidence, okay? So once again, make sure you pause here, make sure you understand what you're viewing. Again, you can refer to this specific figure on page 178. Okay. But moving on, okay. Single subject research relies heavily on a very different approach called visual inspection, which means plotting individual participants' data. Single subject researchers take several factors into account: level, trend, and latency, okay? So changes in the level of the dependent variable from condition to condition is what we are referring to when we talk about level. If the dependent variable is much higher or much lower in one condition than another, then it suggests that the treatment had some sort of effect. Trend refers to the gradual increase or decrease in the dependent variable across all of the observations. Latency refers to the time it takes for the dependent variable to begin changing after a change in condition. Okay. Here we have figure 10.6. You can find this figure on page 180 in your textbook, and the book's right there. So, okay. So 10.6 in your on page 180 in your textbook. Again, this is a visual inspection of the data that suggests an effective treatment in the top panel, but an ineffective treatment in the bottom panel. Okay. So in the top panel of figure 10.6, again, it's right at the top, there are fairly obvious changes in the level and the trend of the dependent variable from condition to condition. Again, condition in one panel, condition in the next, condition in the third. Furthermore, the latencies of these changes are short and the change happens immediately. This pattern of results strongly suggests that the treatment was responsible for the changes in the dependent variable. Then, in the bottom panel of the figure, the changes in levels are fairly small. Again, go from panel to panel to panel. Okay? And although there appears to be an increasing trend in the condition, so after going from one condition to another condition, it looks as though it might be a continuation of a trend that had already begun during the initial baseline. Okay. This pattern of results strongly suggests that the treatment was not responsible for any changes in the dependent variable, at least not to the extent that the single subject researchers typically hope to see in their own research designs. Okay. Moving on, okay. The results of single subject research can be analyzed using statistical procedures, and this is becoming increasingly common. The mean and standard deviation of the participants' response under each conditions are computed and compared, and inferential statistical tests such as t-test or analysis of variance are applied. Okay, the percentage of non-overlapping data, also known as PND, is the percentage of responses in the treatment condition that are more extreme than the most extreme response in a relative control condition. Okay, so just some of the quick takeaways from part 2 of chapter 10. Single subject research design typically involves measuring the dependent variable repeatedly over time and changing conditions. So from the baseline to treatment when the dependent variable has reached a steady state. This approach allows researchers to see what changes in the independent variable are causing changes in the dependent variable. In a reversal design, the participant is tested in the baseline condition, then tested in the treatment condition, and then returned back to baseline. If the dependent variable changes with the introduction of the treatment and then changes back with the return to baseline, this provides strong evidence of the treatment actually being effective or working. In a multiple baseline design, baselines are established for different participants, different dependent variables, or different settings, and the treatment is introduced at different times on each baseline. If the introduction of the treatment is followed by a change in the dependent variable on each baseline, this provides strong evidence of treatment effect. Single subject researchers typically analyze their data by graphing them and making judgments about whether the independent variable is effective or affecting the dependent variable based on level, trend, and latency. Okay. Our last section goes into the single subject versus the group debate. In this specific section of our textbook, the third section, Paul Price is going to explain some of the points of disagreement between advocates of single subject and group research. He's also going to identify several situations in which single subject research would be appropriate and several others in which group research would be appropriate. Okay, so continuing, okay, data analysis. So as it pertains to data analysis, single subject research is similar to group research, especially to experimental group research. Both quantitative approaches try to establish causal relationships by manipulating independent variable, measuring a dependent variable, and controlling extraneous variables. Visual inspection is an inadequate method for deciding whether and to what extent a treatment has affected a dependent variable. Okay, visual inspection can be unreliable with different researchers reaching different conclusions about the same data, the same set of data. Results of visual inspection and overall visual inspection and overall judgment of whether or not a treatment was effective cannot be clearly and efficiently summarized or compared across studies. Okay. Advocates of group research worry that visual inspection is an inadequate method for deciding whether and to what extent treatment has affected a dependent variable. One specific concern is that visual inspection is not sensitive enough to detect weak effects. Okay. A second is that visual inspection can be unreliable, with different researchers reaching different conclusions about the same set of data, as I already stated. A third is that the results of visual inspection, an overall judgment of whether or not a treatment was effective, cannot be clearly and efficiently summarized or compared across all studies. Okay. Quickly, I still have some notes, so I'm just going to stop sharing here. There's other issues, and I'm going to quickly just go over them. The second issue about which single subject and group researchers sometimes disagree has to do with external validity, which is the ability to generalize the results of the study beyond itself. Single subject researchers have concerns of their own about external validity, specifically about group research. Single subject research is particularly good for testing the effectiveness of treatment on individuals when the focus is on strong, consistent, and biologically or socially important effects. Group research, on the other hand, is good for testing the effectiveness of treatments at the group level. Lastly, group research is also good for studying interactions between treatments and participant characteristics. Okay, and quickly, the main takeaways from the third section of chapter 10. Okay, the differences between single subject and group research sometimes lead to disagreements between single subjects, those who study single subject research and those who study group research. These misunderstandings center around the issues specifically about data analysis, how to analyze the data, and external validity, especially generalizations to other people. Single subject and group research are best seen as complementary methods with different strengths and weaknesses that are appropriate for answering different kinds of research questions. Again, the method that you will use in your future research is going to depend on the answers that you want to arrive at. Okay, so that's the major takeaway. Sound good? So that's chapter 10. This week, very simple week. Again, chapter 10 quiz, read chapter 10, and then work on passing in that literature review. Sound good? See you guys later. Peace out.